The Dyatlov Pass Incident. Part 1. Introduction and the Expedition. Introduction. February 1959. The remote northern Ural Mountains lay beneath endless snow and ice. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, while powerful winds swept across the barren slopes. The indigenous Mansi people called one mountain Kholat Syakhl, the Mountain of the Dead. Here, one of the 20th century's greatest mysteries would unfold. 9 experienced hikers, all young, healthy, and highly trained, set out on a difficult winter expedition led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov. Within days, every member would be dead. No witnesses survived. No definitive explanation has ever been accepted. More than 60 years later, investigators, scientists, and theorists still debate what happened. Was it a natural disaster, human error, or something far stranger? Tonight, we will examine the evidence, separate facts from myths, and retrace the expedition's final days. The expedition begins. The expedition began on January 23, 1959, when the group left Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg. Their goal was to ski more than 350 kilometers through one of the Soviet Union's harshest winter regions before reaching Mount Otertan. The route carried the highest hiking difficulty rating. The hikers were students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute. Their leader, Igor Dyatlov, was respected for his planning and survival skills. Among the team were the optimistic Zinaida Kolmogorova, determined Rustem Slobodin, resilient Lyudmila Dubinina, and World War II veteran Semyon Zolotaryov. Originally, there had been 10 participants. Shortly after the journey began, Yuri Yudin developed severe back and leg pain and reluctantly returned home. Years later, he would become known as the expedition's only survivor. The final happy days. Despite brutal weather, morale remained high. The hikers kept diaries filled with humor and optimism. They joked about frozen boots. They laughed at the wind. They photographed one another skiing through deep snow. Those photographs reveal smiling friends completely unaware of what awaited them. On February 1st, 1959, the group reached the slope of Kholat Syakhl. Strong winds and blowing snow reduced visibility. Rather than descending into the forest, Dyatlov chose to pitch the tent on the exposed mountainside. The hikers carved a platform into the snow and raised their canvas tent. They prepared dinner. They wrote in their journals. One final photograph shows them struggling against fierce winds while setting up camp. It is the last known image of the Dyatlov group alive. As darkness settled over the mountain, temperatures continued to fall. Inside the tent, 9 experienced hikers prepared for another cold night. None of them could have imagined that before dawn, something would force every one of them to abandon the safety of that shelter and run into the freezing darkness. Part 2. The Search and the Night of Terror. The search days passed. Igor Dyatlov had promised to send a telegram after the expedition, but no message arrived. At first, no one worried. Experienced hikers were often delayed. But as the silence continued, concern grew. On February 20th, a search operation began. Students, volunteers, military personnel, and rescue teams searched the mountains. For several days, they found nothing. Then, on February 26th, searchers discovered the expedition's tent. The discovery. The tent was partially collapsed beneath the snow. Most of the group's equipment remained inside. Boots, heavy jackets, food, cameras. Everything suggested the hikers had intended to return. Then investigators found something astonishing. Several cuts had been made through the tent, from the inside. Instead of using the entrance, someone had slashed through the canvas in desperate haste. The footprints investigators found footprints leading away from the campsite. Some were barefoot. Some wore only socks. Others wore a single boot. The tracks descended toward the forest nearly 1.5 kilometers away. There were no signs of panic, violence, or pursuit. The tragedy in the forest. At the edge of the forest, beneath a large cedar tree, rescuers found the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. Both wore only underwear. Nearby were the remains of a small fire. Broken branches suggested someone had climbed the tree. Both men died from hypothermia. Soon, 3 more bodies were found between the cedar and the tent. Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin. Each appeared to have been trying to return to the campsite. The final victims. Slobodin had a small skull fracture, but exposure remained the cause of death. 4 hikers were still missing. Only after the spring thaw did rescuers discover them beneath deep snow in a ravine. Unlike the others, they were better dressed. Some wore clothing removed from the first victims in an attempt to survive. But their injuries shocked investigators. Lyudmila Dubinina had devastating chest trauma. Semyon Zolotaryov suffered multiple fractured ribs. Alexander Kolovatov had neck injuries. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol sustained a severe skull fracture. The unanswered questions. Medical examiners concluded that enormous force had caused the injuries, yet there were almost no external wounds, no evidence of prolonged violence, no signs of another group. Some clothing later showed traces of radioactive contamination. Witnesses also reported glowing orange lights moving across the night sky around the time of the tragedy. Whether they were connected has never been established. Every new discovery answered one question and created several more. What forced 9 experienced mountaineers to abandon their only shelter? Why did some try to return to the tent? What caused the catastrophic injuries of the final 4? More than 60 years later, those questions remain at the heart of one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Part 3. The Evidence and the Theories. The Official Investigation. As investigators continued examining the evidence, one thing became increasingly clear. There was no single clue that explained everything. Instead, each discovery seemed to contradict the last. The official Soviet investigation concluded that the hikers had died as the result of what it described as a compelling natural force. No further explanation was given. The wording immediately raised questions. What exactly did that mean? Why wasn't the force identified? And why did the investigation end without a definitive conclusion? Those unanswered questions fueled decades of speculation. Debunking the myths, some details quickly became the center of public fascination. One of the most discussed involved Lyudmila Dubinina. When her body was recovered nearly 3 months later from the snow-filled ravine, investigators noted that her tongue, parts of her lips, and soft tissue around the mouth were missing. For years, this detail became one of the most sensational aspects of the case. However, modern forensic specialists offer a far less mysterious explanation. Dubinina's body had spent weeks beneath snow in a damp ravine, where flowing meltwater, freezing temperatures, and natural decomposition affected exposed soft tissues. According to forensic experts, these conditions, combined with the activity of small scavengers, can explain the absence of delicate tissue without requiring any unusual event. Another frequently misunderstood detail involves radiation. Tests performed on several items of clothing detected traces of radioactive contamination. At first glance, this seemed to support theories involving secret military experiments, but the evidence is less dramatic than many people assume. Only a limited number of clothing samples showed elevated readings, and no direct connection between the radiation and the hikers' deaths has ever been established. the physics of trauma. Then there were the injuries. Several victims suffered devastating fractures to the ribs and skull. Medical experts noted that these injuries required tremendous force, yet the skin showed surprisingly little external damage. How could that be? Modern trauma specialists point out that similar injury patterns can occur during extremely high-pressure impacts spread across a broad surface. In other words, powerful compression, not necessarily an attack with a weapon, can produce severe internal injuries while leaving relatively minor external marks. This observation shifted attention away from theories involving violent human attackers and toward possible natural explanations. The avalanche theory. Over the decades, dozens of theories have emerged. One of the earliest explanations suggested an avalanche. For many years, critics dismissed this idea. But in recent years, researchers revisited the evidence using modern computer simulations. Instead of a classic avalanche, they proposed a slab avalanche, a dense, compact layer of snow capable of breaking loose and striking with enormous force. According to this theory, the hikers may have heard the snow shifting above them or felt pressure building against the tent. Fearing a larger collapse, they cut their way out and quickly moved downhill. The slab itself may have been relatively small, explaining why obvious avalanche debris was no longer visible when rescuers arrived weeks later. Military and the unknown. Military testing remains another popular theory. Some witnesses reported seeing glowing orange spheres in the night sky around the time of the incident. Others speculated about secret parachute mines or missile tests. Despite decades of investigation, however, no verified evidence has ever directly linked military activity to the deaths of the Dyatlov group. Perhaps the most mysterious explanations involve the unknown. Stories about the Mansi people, secret government cover-ups, and even supernatural forces have become deeply woven into the legend of Dyatlov Pass. Yet, investigators found no evidence that the Mansi people attacked the hikers. In fact, the Mansi actively participated in the search efforts and were quickly cleared of suspicion. Conclusion. As the years passed, the mystery grew larger than the tragedy itself. Each generation added new theories. Each documentary introduced new possibilities. Each discovery inspired fresh debate. But the mountain remained silent. Part 4. Modern investigations and conclusion, the official conclusion. For decades, the Dyatlov Pass Incident remained one of history's most famous unsolved mysteries. Countless books were written. Television programs explored every possible explanation. Scientists, journalists, and independent investigators returned to the mountain again and again, hoping to uncover the missing piece of the puzzle. Then, in 2019, Russian authorities reopened the case. The investigation was led by Russia's Prosecutor General's office, which reviewed archived documents, examined weather records, recreated the hikers' route, and consulted avalanche specialists. After months of analysis, officials announced their conclusion. According to the investigation, the most likely cause was a slab avalanche. Investigators believe that after pitching their tent on a snow-covered slope, the hikers unintentionally weakened the snowpack while cutting a platform for the campsite. Later that night, a dense slab of snow may have shifted onto the tent. It may not have been a massive avalanche, like those often seen in documentaries. Instead, it could have been a compact, heavy block of snow, large enough to trap or injure the occupants, but small enough for wind and later snowfall to erase much of the visible evidence before rescuers arrived weeks later. The final moments, faced with the possibility of another collapse, the group likely chose the fastest escape route. Rather than wasting precious seconds searching for the entrance, they cut through the tent fabric and moved downhill into the darkness. From there, the situation may have deteriorated rapidly. Separated by darkness, crippled by freezing temperatures, and forced to make impossible decisions under extreme stress. Their chances of survival grew smaller with every passing minute. The official investigation concluded that hypothermia ultimately claimed most of their lives, while the severe injuries suffered by some members could be explained by the immense force of compressed snow and later falls into the ravine. The enduring mystery. Yet not everyone accepts this explanation. Some researchers argue that it still leaves unanswered questions. Why were the injuries so unevenly distributed? Why did some hikers attempt to return to the tent, while others remained in the forest? And why did the final four travel into the ravine instead of staying together? Even today, complete agreement remains elusive. Perhaps that is why the Dyatlov Pass Incident continues to fascinate people around the world. It is not simply because 9 people lost their lives. Tragic accidents happen every year. What makes this story unforgettable is the absence of certainty. The missing final chapter. The silence left behind. Closing thoughts. Every photograph recovered from the expedition captures ordinary young people laughing, skiing, and enjoying an adventure with friends. They had dreams, families waiting for them, plans for the future. None of them could have imagined that the mountain surrounding them would one day become one of the most famous locations in modern mystery. The wind erased their footprints long ago. Snow covered their final campsite. Time slowly faded the physical evidence, but the questions remained. Perhaps we will never know exactly what happened during those final hours on the frozen slopes of Kolatsiakl. Maybe no single theory will ever explain every detail, and perhaps that is precisely why this case refuses to disappear. Because sometimes, the most haunting mysteries are not the ones with impossible answers, but the ones that come painfully close to being understood. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary and would like to explore more of history's greatest unsolved mysteries, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time. Stay curious.